Okay, so as we talked about before, a lot of drums on the market, a lot of steel tongue drums on the market are made from old propane tanks that are no longer in service as a propane tank. But the old propane tanks, the problem with them, the reason why they're no longer in service as a propane tank is one of three reasons. Either A, it's got a crack or a hole in it and it leaks propane out of it, or two, the rust pitting on the steel, because it is just low carbon steel, and sometimes around the bottom ring and the bottom of the propane tank they get a little bit of rough treatment and the paint gets knocked off, and then there may be in a salty air environment and they start to rust up and then get big pits, rust pits in it, and the steel becomes too thin to be safely used as propane, so they can't use it as a propane tank anymore. The third reason why it can no longer be in service as a propane tank is every so many years the propane tank has to go through something called hydrostat testing, and this measures the strength of the tank as a whole, but it also measures the elasticity of the steel, whether it can stretch and come back into shape or not, because propane will expand and contract depending on how hot it is outside. So basically, here's how hydrostat testing works and what they look for. So if this is a propane tank, I take the valve off and I fill this with water. And I put this inside of another container. And then I fill this container with water. And I put a whole cover over the whole thing. And I put a line to the top of the propane tank, come out with water. I cover this tightly, and then I have a hole on the side over here, and I apply pressure, and the pressure goes into the inside of the cylinder, and the pressure isn't through air, because air will compress. The pressure is water pressure, and this will make the tank expand a little bit, and when it expands it pushes this water on the outside out, and I measure how much water comes out. And if the water keeps coming out, that means there's a hole in the tank someplace or a crack, and it's failed hydrostat test and has to be thrown away. But also, when the metal becomes brittle, it loses its elasticity. So after I apply the right amount of pressure, water pressure to it, measure how much water comes out, I then relieve the pressure and the tank should go back into shape again. And when it does, it sucks all this water I push out back in. I measure how much goes back in. If enough goes back in, that means the tank is returned to its original shape and it's still good for propane service. If very little water goes back in, that means the tank bulged out and stayed bulged out because the metal is brittle and it's not flexible enough anymore to be used for propane, and it's failed hydrostat test, and I can't use it for propane service anymore. So I have to put it in the discard pile. So these drums that are made from old propane tanks, the propane tank either had a hole in it, had a lot of rust on it, or it's failed hydrostat test, which means the metal has lost its elasticity. And so the metal becomes brittle. And like on this drum here, which I made in 2008, back when I didn't know any better, has a note that's sticking out on it. I don't know if you can see it right there. And I'm afraid to push this back in because the metal is brittle, and there's a really good chance that it will break right here or crack right across here because the metal is so brittle. So if you have these with old propane tanks, if you push down on them too hard, you might just break this tab right off. These are really thick, but the metal is really brittle. It's hard, but it's brittle. And so that's a little bit about hydrostat testing, and this is another reason why, in my opinion, I've gone through the learning curve. I've been making these drums for 12 years now. I moved away from propane tanks about 8 years ago, and we went to new steel, then went to zinc-plated new steel, and now we've gone to even a better quality, a thicker steel, and we're using high-quality stainless steel now. And so we've solved all those problems, and we have a much, much better, sounding